September 1, 1939. German forces surged deep into Poland, determined to win a rapid and total victory. Barely 2 decades earlier, their fathers and grandfathers had also been marching but in retreat, returning home as a beaten army. In November 1918, after 4 brutal years of the First World War, Germany's emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, had been forced to abdicate. His armies were collapsing under relentless attacks from British, French, and American troops. The German people were starving, exhausted, and humiliated. Yet, even as the war ended, a dangerous myth began to take root that Germany's army had never truly been defeated on the battlefield, but rather betrayed by weak and treacherous politicians back home. Nevertheless, at 11 a.m., on November 11, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns finally fell silent. The Great War had ended. A month later, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson arrived in Europe, promising to create a new world built on peace and cooperation. He persuaded world leaders to form the League of Nations, a body meant to resolve disputes through diplomacy instead of war. At the Treaty of Versailles, new borders were drawn, and old empires were carved apart. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was dismantled, birthing new nations: Austria, Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Germany itself was drastically reduced in size. But hidden within this peace settlement was a time bomb. Not everyone celebrated these new borders. Several of the new states, such as Czechoslovakia, contained large German-speaking minorities. One day, the desire to reunite those separated German peoples would return to haunt Europe. On top of territorial losses, the German people suffered one final humiliation. They were forced to pay £6.6 billion in reparations to Britain and France, a debt they could barely afford. When Wilson returned to the United States, his grand vision quickly collapsed. The U.S. Congress refused to join the League of Nations, fearing it would drag America into future European wars. The U.S. turned inward, adopting isolationism. Germany, meanwhile, became a very different country. It remained Europe's largest nation, but its old militaristic monarchy was gone, replaced by a fragile democracy, the Weimar Republic. The young republic soon faced chaos. Street battles erupted between violent right-wing nationalists and communists seeking revolution. Then, in 1923, the economy imploded in a storm of hyperinflation, with prices soaring by hundreds of % each month. Life savings were wiped out overnight. Poverty and despair spread perfect conditions for a new kind of radical politics. Among those who rose from this turmoil was Adolf Hitler. Born in Austria, he had fought bravely in World War I, earning the Iron Cross. Returning to Germany after the war, he settled in Munich, where his fiery speeches soon brought him to the head of a small, fringe group, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party. In October 1923, Hitler and his followers attempted to overthrow the Weimar government in a failed coup, the Beer Hall Putsch. He was arrested and sentenced to 9 months in prison. During that time, he wrote Mein Kampf, My Struggle, a book in which he blamed Germany's defeat on the Jews and the nation's politicians, while calling for expansion eastward to gain living space. Upon his release, Hitler reorganized the Nazi Party into a disciplined political machine. From then on, he vowed to seize power not by force, but through the ballot box. For several years, Weimar Germany recovered. The economy stabilized, foreign investment returned, and extremist movements lost ground. But everything changed in October 1929, when the Wall Street crash sent shockwaves across the globe. The Great Depression struck Germany with devastating force. 6 million people became unemployed. Desperation filled the streets. In this climate, radical voices again gained power, especially Hitler's. By 1931, the Nazis had become a mass movement with their own paramilitary force, the SA, or stormtroopers, numbering nearly 3 million men. In the 1932 elections, the Nazis became the largest party in the Reichstag, Germany's parliament. But Hitler refused to join a coalition, paralyzing the government. To break the deadlock, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed him chancellor in January 1933. Within a month, the Reichstag building burned down. Hitler blamed the communists and demanded emergency powers to protect Germany. He used those powers to outlaw all other political parties. When Hindenburg died in August 1934, Hitler merged the offices of President and Chancellor, declaring himself Führer, the absolute leader of Germany. At first, few outside observers foresaw the storm that was coming. Hitler focused on rebuilding Germany's economy, pouring millions into public works, including a vast autobahn network to reduce unemployment. But secretly, he was spending even more on rearmament. The Versailles Treaty had restricted Germany's army to 100,000 men and banned tanks, aircraft, and submarines. Hitler ignored these limits. He tripled the army's size and, in 1935, unveiled a brand new air force, the Luftwaffe, boasting 2,500 aircraft, more than Britain or France. Unemployment plummeted, and Hitler's popularity soared. Then came his first bold move abroad. In 1935, Germany reclaimed the Saar region after a plebiscite. The following year, he sent troops into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone forbidden by Versailles. Many Europeans shrugged. It seemed only fair that Germany should control its own borders again. When Berlin hosted the 1936 Olympic Games, the Nazis appeared to the world as strong, organized, and fair-minded, a government restoring national pride. But beneath the surface, dark signs were already visible. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 stripped German Jews of citizenship and banned them from marrying Aryan Germans. Still, the first serious threats to global peace didn't come from Hitler at all, but from across the world, in Asia. At the dawn of the 20th century, Japan had already emerged as a major military power. It had defeated Russia in 1905 and fought alongside the Allies during World War I. After the war, Japan joined the League of Nations as a recognized world power. But politically, it was unstable, a strange mix of modern democracy and ancient feudal traditions. Most Japanese still revered the emperor as a living god. Meanwhile, the country was bursting at the seams. Its population was booming, and it lacked the natural resources needed to fuel industrial growth. Japanese leaders looked abroad for solutions, and they saw opportunity in Manchuria, a region of China rich in coal, minerals, and farmland. Japan already had troops stationed there, and its ambitions soon expanded to other nearby colonies: Burma, Malaya, Hong Kong, Indochina, and the Dutch East Indies, territories controlled by European empires. But Japan had to tread carefully. The Pacific's other superpower, the United States, loomed large. Though America preached anti-imperialism, it effectively ran its own Pacific empire, ruling the Philippines, Guam, and several island chains. For now, America was distracted. The 1920s were its jazz age, a decade of unprecedented prosperity and indulgence. The U.S. Navy had been cut back after the war, and Washington had signed naval reduction treaties with Britain, France, and Japan, effectively giving Japan dominance in Pacific waters. Then, the Great Depression hit. Factories closed, a quarter of Americans lost their jobs, and thousands were left homeless. Amid this suffering, Japan saw its chance. In 1931, without even notifying its own civilian government, Japanese officers in Manchuria staged an incident at Mukden and seized control of the region. They swiftly conquered all of Manchuria and established a puppet state, Manchukuo, with Henry Puyi, the last emperor of China, as its figurehead ruler. At its headquarters in Geneva, the League of Nations faced its first major crisis. It condemned Japan's aggression, and Japan simply walked out. The League realized, too late, that it had no power to enforce its rulings. Japan was branded an international outlaw, but its leaders didn't care. Their eyes were already on further expansion into China. China itself was divided and chaotic. General Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government was locked in civil war with the Chinese Communists led by Mao Zedong. In 1936, Japan and Nazi Germany signed an anti-communist pact, aimed at deterring any Soviet move toward China. A year later, a skirmish near Beijing escalated into full-scale war. The Second Sino-Japanese War had begun. At first, Chinese forces were caught off guard, but they soon rallied, with communists and nationalists forming an uneasy alliance. Japan responded with overwhelming force, amphibious landings and aerial bombardments. By the end of 1937, northern China and the entire eastern coast had fallen. Cities like Shanghai were bombed mercilessly. Western civilians fled as Japanese troops advanced. Then came Nanking. On December 17, 1937, Japanese troops captured the Chinese capital and unleashed one of the most horrific massacres in modern history. Over 300,000 civilians were slaughtered in 6 weeks of murder, rape, and destruction. Japanese aircraft even attacked foreign ships, including British and American vessels. On December 12, Japanese bombers sank the USS Panay, killing 50 American sailors. Despite these provocations, the Western powers hesitated. President Franklin D. Roosevelt considered a naval blockade of Japan but could not persuade Britain to risk war. The U.S. instead offered a $25 million loan to Chiang Kai-shek for arms, a token gesture. The Soviet Union, though uneasy about Japan's rise, did little beyond small border skirmishes in Manchuria. China, effectively abandoned, was left to fight alone. By 1938, Japan had overrun Canton and pushed Chinese forces deep inland. The League of Nations' promises of peace and security had proven worthless. And now, Europe itself was about to face the same fate. By now, aggression had taken root not only in Asia, but also in southern Europe. Today, it's easy to look back at Benito Mussolini, Italy's fascist dictator, and find his theatrical speeches almost comical. But in 1922, no one was laughing. At that time, Italy stood on the brink of collapse. The nation was paralyzed by strikes, riots, and land seizures. The democratic government seemed weak and helpless. Into this chaos stepped Mussolini, a former journalist and war veteran. He formed a right-wing nationalist organization, the Fascist Party, vowing to restore order and national pride. When a massive general strike threatened to plunge Italy into anarchy in August 1922, Mussolini seized the moment. He ordered his black shirt followers to march on Rome. Fearing civil war, King Victor Emmanuel III capitulated and invited Mussolini to form a government. Once in power, Mussolini quickly dismantled democracy. Opposition parties were banned, elections were abolished, and authority was concentrated entirely in his hands. By decree, Italy became a dictatorship ruled by the fascist Grand Council. Like Hitler later would, Mussolini's first acts brought him huge popularity. Vast public works programs provided jobs and transformed Italy's infrastructure. Corruption was rooted out. Even the mafia was crushed. He expanded the armed forces, built a powerful navy, and developed a modern air force that rivaled Europe's best. In the Mediterranean, Italy's fleet soon surpassed the combined strength of Britain's and France's local forces. When the Great Depression struck, Italy weathered it better than most. To many, Mussolini's regime appeared efficient, patriotic, and strong, everything the struggling democracies of Europe were not. Leaders across the continent, including Adolf Hitler, admired his success and discipline. But Mussolini craved more than admiration. He wanted an empire, a rebirth of Roman glory. His first target, Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia. Italy already controlled colonies bordering Abyssinia, Eritrea to the north and Somaliland to the east. In December 1934, Italian troops deliberately provoked a skirmish at an oasis deep inside Abyssinian territory. Mussolini then flooded the region with reinforcements, demanding reparations for the fabricated incident. The Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, appealed directly to the League of Nations, begging it to uphold its own principles. Here was the League's great moral test. One of its own members, a small nation, was under attack by another. But the League's response was shameful. Britain's foreign minister, Anthony Eden, tried to negotiate peace, but Mussolini ignored him. In October 1935, Italy invaded from both Eritrea and Somaliland. Ethiopia's poorly equipped army stood no chance. Italian forces possessed tanks, artillery, and air superiority. The Italian Air Force dominated the skies, bombing villages, and even using poison gas, a weapon outlawed after World War I. After 6 months of brutal fighting, Ethiopia was conquered. Haile Selassie fled into exile in Britain. From its Geneva headquarters, the League of Nations wrung its hands helplessly. It imposed weak economic sanctions, but they were half-hearted and ineffective. Mussolini's invasion exposed two devastating truths. The League of Nations was powerless, and the supposed great democracies Britain and France no longer had the will to fight. Both nations were still scarred by the horrors of World War I. Their economies had never fully recovered. Strikes, unemployment, and political unrest plagued them throughout the 1920s. Maintaining vast empires drained their treasuries and their patience. Above all, they were haunted by the memory of millions dead in the trenches. British leaders like Lloyd George, Ramsay MacDonald, and especially Stanley Baldwin were determined to keep Britain out of another war at any cost. After World War I, Britain's once mighty conscript army was dismantled into a small professional force, meant only for policing the empire. When the Depression hit, even that modest force was neglected. By the mid-1930s, Britain entered the rising storm economically weak and militarily unprepared. France had suffered even worse in the Great War, losing far more soldiers and entire generations of young men. With a shrinking birth rate, it faced a looming manpower crisis. French leaders knew they could never match Germany in numbers, so they focused on defense. Their answer was the Maginot Line, an immense chain of concrete fortresses along the German border, begun in 1930. The Maginot Line was a marvel of engineering but also a trap of psychology. It turned France into a nation mentally wedded to defense. Its generals believed that if Germany attacked again, the fortifications would hold indefinitely. But the line ended at the Belgian frontier, relying on Belgium to build its own defenses, which it never did. The result, France had built an army that could only fight defensively. It lacked the structure, training, and equipment to wage offensive war. Britain and France also knew that their navies in the Mediterranean were no match for Mussolini's new fleet. So when Italy conquered Ethiopia, both countries did what they had done before: nothing. They considered it someone else's problem, too far away to matter. Instead, they turned inward, consumed by economic hardship and domestic politics. But even as they hesitated, a far greater menace was rising in Europe: a rearmed and resurgent Germany. And soon, Germany and Italy would combine their strength to aid another dictator's rise: General Francisco Franco in Spain. In 1936, Spain erupted into a bloody civil war, a conflict that tore the nation apart. It was a war that pitted brother against brother, communist against fascist, believer against atheist. 5 years earlier, in 1931, Spain had abolished its centuries-old monarchy. King Alfonso XIII fled into exile, and a republic was proclaimed. By February 1936, the left-wing Popular Front coalition narrowly won national elections. Though moderate in its reforms, its victory triggered a wave of strikes and land seizures. The political right panicked, convinced a communist revolution was imminent. Within the military, long a bastion of conservative and Catholic values, officers began plotting a coup. Among them was General Francisco Franco, a seasoned commander exiled to the Canary Islands after clashing with the government. On July 17, 1936, army units in Spain's African colonies mutinied. The next day, Franco flew from the Canaries to join them, proclaiming a nationalist revolt to save Spain. Rebel forces soon seized parts of mainland Spain, while the Republic called for volunteers to defend democracy. The nation was now divided: Republicans versus nationalists, left versus right. Initially, Franco faced a logistical nightmare. His army was trapped in North Africa, cut off from the mainland. He turned to a foreign leader for help: Adolf Hitler. Hitler saw Spain as the perfect testing ground for his new weapons and tactics. Within weeks, German transport planes from the Luftwaffe began airlifting Franco's troops across the Strait of Gibraltar, the first large-scale military airlift in history. At first, the Republican government controlled most of Spain's east, including Madrid and Barcelona, while the nationalists held the northwest and parts of the south. But that balance changed when Hitler and Mussolini began flooding Franco with troops, planes, and tanks. Germany sent its Condor Legion, equipped with advanced bombers and fighters, and 12,000 military volunteers. Italy dispatched over 50,000 troops and 700 aircraft, calling them volunteers as well. The Republic pleaded with Britain, France, and the Soviet Union for aid, but London and Paris feared triggering a wider war. They adopted a policy of non-intervention, even as Germany and Italy blatantly ignored it. Finally, Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union decided to intervene. Fearing the spread of fascism, he sent 700 advisors, along with tanks and aircraft. Yet his contribution was limited, not enough to offset the fascist advantage. Meanwhile, thousands of idealists from around the world poured into Spain to fight for the Republic. They formed the International Brigades, 30,000 volunteers from America, Britain, France, and beyond. Despite their courage, they were outmatched. By the end of 1936, Franco's nationalists surrounded Madrid on three sides. The capital endured relentless bombing and siege. The fighting was savage. Civilians suffered atrocities from both sides: priests murdered by Republicans, suspected communists executed by nationalists. German and Italian aircraft bombed cities indiscriminately, using Spain as a proving ground for modern warfare. The most infamous attack came in April 1937, when the Basque town of Guernica was obliterated by the Condor Legion, killing thousands of civilians. As the war dragged on, the Republic fractured internally. Communists and socialists wanted to focus on winning the war, while anarchists and idealists saw it as the beginning of a broader social revolution. These divisions exploded into violence in Barcelona in May 1937, when leftist factions turned their guns on each other. It was a fatal blow to the Republican cause. By 1938, the nationalists had captured nearly all of Spain. Madrid, isolated and starving, finally surrendered in March 1939. A month later, Franco declared victory. Spain's civil war was over, but its scars would last generations. Internationally, the war's outcome was catastrophic. Franco's triumph emboldened Hitler and Mussolini, convincing them that the democracies would never resist. Stalin, meanwhile, lost faith in Britain and France, concluding they would never stand up to fascism. Even before Spain's agony ended, Hitler's armies were already on the move. From the very day he became Chancellor of Germany on January 30, 1933, Adolf Hitler began putting his long-term ambitions into motion. Just days later, on February 3, he gathered his top military commanders and laid out his ultimate objective: the conquest of territory in the east and the ruthless Germanization of those lands. His generals were instructed to prepare for massive military expansion. Although the Treaty of Versailles forbade Germany from possessing tanks, the regime had already found a loophole. A secret agreement with the Soviet Union, signed back in 1923, allowed German engineers to test armored designs and experiment with new mobile tactics inside Soviet territory. A new generation of energetic German officers, men like Heinz Guderian, eagerly absorbed the revolutionary theories of British military thinkers such as Basil Liddell Hart and Colonel J.F.C. Fuller. They studied how combined forces of tanks, artillery, and infantry could move together rapidly to pierce enemy lines and exploit breakthroughs. By observing British exercises on Salisbury Plain, these officers began forming the foundations of what would later be known as Blitzkrieg Lightning War. Hitler was captivated by these ideas. Under his direction, the German army was restructured to include 3 panzer divisions, each combining speed, coordination, and overwhelming firepower. Meanwhile, Germany's new air force, the Luftwaffe, flourished under the command of former World War I ace Hermann Göring. Even during the years when the Air Force was officially banned, Germany had secretly maintained its aviation expertise through civilian programs and gliding clubs, quietly training a future generation of pilots. In March 1935, Hitler publicly unveiled the Luftwaffe to the world. At the same time, he announced a massive expansion of the army to 300,000 men and reintroduced conscription, an open violation of the Versailles Treaty. Britain and France issued formal protests, but their words carried no weight. Their own militaries were unprepared for confrontation, and they hoped appeasement would keep the peace. Hitler took their weakness as encouragement. Until now, he had confined himself to reclaiming German-speaking territories, the Rhineland, the Saarlands he argued rightfully belonged to Germany. But soon, he set his sights on a far greater prize, his homeland itself, Austria. 4 years earlier, Austrian Nazis had attempted to seize power and merge their country with Germany, but the coup had failed. The dream of union, the Anschluss, had not died. In February 1938, Austrian Chancellor Kurt von Schuschnigg discovered another Nazi plot and protested directly to Hitler. Hitler responded with fury, demanding Austria stop its supposed persecution of Austrian Nazis and agree to unite with Germany. To defuse the crisis, Schuschnigg announced a referendum so the Austrian people could vote on independence. But Hitler feared a rejection and decided not to risk it. On March 12, 1938, German troops crossed the border. There was no resistance. Crowds cheered, Nazi flags filled Vienna's streets, and within hours, Austria was absorbed into the Third Reich. For the first time, Hitler had annexed an entirely sovereign state, and again, the Western powers did nothing. Emboldened, Hitler turned to his next target, Czechoslovakia. The country's northwestern region, the Sudetenland, was home to a large German minority who had once belonged to the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. Hitler demanded that these oppressed Germans be allowed to join the Reich. The Czechoslovak government, backed by France, refused. It mobilized its army, one of the most modern and well-equipped in Europe, and prepared to fight. For a moment, Europe teetered on the brink of war. But instead of standing firm, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain chose to seek compromise. He flew to meet Hitler not once, but twice, hoping to avert catastrophe. Hitler assured him that if Germany could have the Sudetenland, he would make no further territorial demands. On September 29, 1938, the leaders of Germany, Britain, France, and Italy met in Munich. The result, the Munich Agreement. Without consulting Czechoslovakia itself, Britain and France handed over the Sudetenland to Hitler in exchange for a signed promise of peace. Chamberlain returned to London triumphantly, waving the document he believed guaranteed peace for our time. On October 1, German forces marched into the Sudetenland, seizing Czechoslovakia's crucial border defenses without firing a shot. But Hitler's ambitions were far from satisfied. Next, he looked east toward Poland. His excuse was the same, the protection of ethnic Germans. He demanded that Poland return the port of Danzig, Gdansk, to German control, linking East Prussia with the rest of the Reich. The Polish government flatly refused. For once, Britain and France drew a line. They publicly guaranteed Poland's independence, warning that any German attack would mean war. But before striking Poland, Hitler had one last loose end to tie up: Czechoslovakia itself. In March 1939, he summoned Czech Prime Minister Emil Hácha to Berlin and bullied him through the night until he agreed to place his country under German protection. The next day, German troops occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. Slovakia was made a puppet state, the remainder was absorbed into the Reich. For the first time, Hitler had taken land that was not even German-speaking, a clear act of outright aggression. Even then, Britain and France protested weakly. Their appeasement policy had failed, but they still hoped to avoid war. In the spring of 1939, Hitler renewed his demand for Danzig. Poland refused again, and this time Britain and France promised to stand firm. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Joseph Stalin watched events with growing unease. The Soviet dictator feared German expansion but distrusted the Western powers even more. In April 1939, Stalin proposed an alliance with Britain and France, but negotiations dragged on without progress. Convinced that the West was stalling, Stalin made a shocking move. On August 23, 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov, Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty that stunned the world. Publicly, it pledged peace between the two ideological enemies. Privately, it contained a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe between them. Poland would be carved in half, while the Baltic states Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania would fall under Soviet control. Now free from the threat of a two-front war, Hitler gave the order to strike. On the night of August 31, 1939, German troops gathered along the Polish border. In the early hours of the next morning, they stormed across. World War II had begun.